שלום לכם. אם רק היה לנו מדריך שמרכז את הטיפים לתקשורת עם מקבלי החלטות, ולו רק הוא היה מבוסס על מחקר. אז זהו, שיש. פרופסור ליז שוהי מהמחלקה לממשל באמריקן יוניברסיטי היא מומחית לדעת קהל, פסיכולוגיה פוליטית ותקשורת פוליטית. בשנים האחרונות היא מתעניינת גם בתקשורת המדע, בין מדענים לבין קובעי מדיניות בממשל האמריקאי. על בסיס ממצאי מחקריה, היא חיברה עם עמיתים ספרון שמרכז המלצות לתקשורת המדע עם קובעי מדיניות, מציע שפע של תובנות שרלוונטיות גם לנו בישראל. וכדי שנוכל לשמוע על ההמלצות הללו, אני אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Shalom and welcome to Professor Elizabeth Shuhai from the Department of Government at the American University, who is the lead author of Recommended Practices for Science Communication with Policymakers. Hello, Liz.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Liz, the report is an outcome of a research project on evidence-based science communication with policymakers. How do you study such a topic?
Well, first of all, I want to mention that I had a great team that I was working with. I was working with Emily Cloyd and Aaron Heath from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and also with Aaron Nash, who now works in policy in Australia. So we carried out our research in 3 different stages. So first of all, we did 40 interviews with people who worked in the US Congress. So this is interviews with 20 members of Congress and 20 staff. And then we also carried out a survey of about 700 US scientists. And then finally, we did an extensive literature review looking across multiple fields on this topic. And, most important, we were really focused on what makes for successful science communication with policymakers and what makes for unsuccessful communication with policymakers.
So I guess my next question is, what makes a successful communication with policymakers, an unsuccessful one?
Right. So we learned a lot. The first thing that we learned is you have to remember that policymakers are doing so many different things that they aren't experts. They have to learn about so many different topics. And so you really do need to approach them as if they're lay people. They're not scientists. And so you use actually the same techniques for speaking with the public as you do with speaking with policymakers. So these are things like storytelling, using concrete examples, in general, framing your research so that it seems relevant to their lives. So that said, policymakers are not ordinary people. They're very busy. They have very specific jobs that they need to carry out. And so we also recommend that before you communicate with policymakers, you really should learn quite a bit about the policymaker that you're speaking with or communicating with. You want to learn about their goals, their job responsibilities, and then you want to think about how your research, your interests actually overlap with theirs. They're much more likely to listen to you if you can find a way to help them while also helping yourself.
And do you see a difference across scientific fields or countries? Is it different between cultures?
So this is something we've just looked at a little bit. Our impression as to scientific fields is that there's more interest in science communication among social scientists, maybe because their research is more relatable to lay people, more easily relatable. We also see more interest in science communication among people who study politicized topics. And we can only guess as to why that is, but my sense is that in some cases, scientists feel as though they have no choice, right? They really need to be communicating more often when something's politicized. As for differences across countries, and if we're thinking about science communication between scientists and policymakers specifically, there's a wide range of, there's a lot of variation in the strength of those ties. And a lot of that variation, I think, has to do with, frankly, how much emphasis the government puts on evidence-based policymaking. So, for example, in the UK, you've seen an emphasis on this for a long time. And in my opinion, they're way out ahead of the United States.
So you mentioned politicized science, and I'm thinking about the polarized opinions towards science that can sometimes have a really chilling effect. In the US, for example, scientists who report inconvenient findings can face threats to decrease or eliminate their agency's funding or efforts to discredit them. And I was wondering, how can scientists cope with this type of atmosphere?
I first of all, I think there's a big difference between, university scientists, people who are working outside government, versus scientists who are working within government, and also scientists who may be outside government but really have gotten involved in politics. So I actually think for a typical scientist working outside government, working outside politics, there's not too big of a concern for harassment or funding cuts. As long as you stick to your science, you focus on explaining to people how it's relevant to their lives, you don't wade into unnecessary policy debates. I think you shouldn't be overly worried about that kind of harassment in particular. If you do wade into politics, I mean, there are admittedly some risks, and so you need to take, I would say, calculated risks and think about how far you want to get into policy debates. But my sense is that if you're really sticking to the science, that these risks are pretty low.
But I'm thinking, what do you do as a scientist when people don't trust the evidence you present, not only your interpretations of these evidence?
Sure, yeah, and that probably happens a lot. So unfortunately, especially as you get into politicized topics, one piece of advice we give is that if you've tried in a conversation to persuade somebody and you feel yourself drifting into an argument with that person, it's best just to stop. Arguments, anger, they don't persuade people. That said, even some people who disagree with you, they may come around eventually. So, scientific communication is not just about speaking with somebody once, it's about multiple conversations. And so there is evidence that multiple conversations, bringing people new evidence, showing some patience can be helpful. The other thing I would say is that, oftentimes that distrust is, has nothing to do with your integrity as a scientist or where you work. It can be personal, it can be social, it can be political, which political party you affiliate with, et cetera. And so something that can be very, very useful is finding an intermediary. So finding somebody that a policymaker trusts, and then having that person vouch for the integrity of your research.
So finding a mediator that the policymakers trust and let them present the evidence, because then the evidence might be more accepted. I understand.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, the distrust that we see in evidence, it so often is not about the evidence per se, it's about how you're perceived as a person. And so if you're in a different social group, different race, ethnicity, different religion, or as I said, associate with different political party, sometimes people won't trust you for that reason. And so assuming you have good research, you can have somebody else present it, or simply have another person, a trusted individual, vouch for your credibility, and then go on and engage in that communication.
It's, in a way, it's really sad, right? Because part of the ethos of science is the idea that it doesn't matter who says it, that the evidence are there, that the science is the same, whoever makes it. So in a way, it's really sad that we need to disregard this ethos in order to communicate it.
That's right. This is a strategic suggestion, but from a moral perspective, it's disappointing.
Yeah. Well, in the recommended practices, you write, remember science is one input of many in the policy process. And I'm wondering, should one of the outcomes of effective science communication be policy making that puts more weight on science as an input?
Absolutely. So that was part of our goal in doing this project, was to have policymakers, use good science more often. And so that's a goal that's important. But how important it is going to depend on the context. As I said, there are some countries that are out ahead of others. There are some issues that are more politicized than others. In the U.S., climate change has really been a mess. But it turns out the U.S. Congress really loves physics, and they fund the NIH well. So there are places where things are okay. I also want to say that part of the reason we put that in our recommended practices is that we also want to remind scientists that there are other legitimate influences on policy besides just science. So, people disagree about their values, their priorities, they have different assessments of risk. And so science is not going to always be able to solve these debates. And just, a little example, to give you a concrete example, in the US during COVID, we had scientists who were, it seemed almost uniformly in favor of people staying home, of the economy being shut down in order to protect people from contracting COVID and slow the pandemic. This said, as you may know, in the US, there were also a lot of people who opposed these measures, who wanted to open the economy, get back to work, etc. We want to think about the fact that most US scientists could work from home, collected a paycheck during the pandemic, but most American workers did not. Many of them, were in the service industry. They literally could not receive any income unless the economy was opened up. I have some neighbors across the street who actually lost their home. It's very sad. And so this is a case where we see more than just science informs a policy decision, but also maybe scientists themselves were mixing in their own perspective, their own values without even realizing it.
Yeah, you're right. So the fact that this group can work from home from the computer doesn't mean that everybody can. And of course, that's part of why you make a recommendation.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
My last question to you would be, what are your main recommendations for a scientist who is looking to communicate with policymakers and to have impact on society?
Sure, yeah. And some of these I've sprinkled throughout the conversation. But I would say the most important thing is to make sure that you clarify how your research is relevant to an individual, how it impacts their lives, why they should care. They're likely to listen to you with a great deal of interest if you can demonstrate that something is relevant to their lives. With policymakers, we want to remember how busy they are, that they have very defined jobs. And so you want to make sure that your goals, you can demonstrate how your goals and their goals overlap and help them achieve their goals, basically help them do their job. Let me also say a little bit more about relationships. So relationships are important, not only in our lives, not only in science communication, with policymakers trying to get to know them better, but relationships actually are also important among scientists and among experts. And so some things you can do to actually communicate more successfully is to work in groups. You can work with national scientific organizations, people at your university. You can work with existing advocacy groups or institutes who may have more experience than you. So often having that kind of group effort strengthens your case, and also, of course, there's strength in numbers. So will likely have you be better received by policymakers.
Thank you, Professor Elizabeth Shuhai from the Department of Government at the American University for this insightful conversation.
Thank you. It's been a delight.